August 19, 1944. Deep within the forests of East Prussia, shielded from the reality of a collapsing empire, lay the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's command headquarters. Here, amidst the concrete bunkers and the suffocating paranoia, the finest minds of the German military machine pored over maps that bled red with defeat. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, traced the impossibly long, thin lines of the Allied advance across France. The lines represented speed, audacity, and a spectacular, unprecedented success. But Jodl, a man whose entire career was built on the cold, hard calculus of warfare, saw something else. He saw a fatal weakness. His staff had done the mathematics. They had calculated the immense distances, the shell-pocked roads, the destroyed bridges separating the Allied spearheads from their supply dumps on the Normandy beaches. General George S. Patton's Third Army, a phantom of steel and fire, was now nearly 400 miles from its lifeline. To the disciplined academic minds of the German General Staff, this wasn't a threat. It was a textbook example of strategic overreach. It was the classic blunder described by the great Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz, the culminating point of attack, the moment an army's strength is so diluted by distance and effort that it becomes vulnerable, its momentum exhausted. Jodl's assessment, delivered with the chilling confidence of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness, echoed through the command bunker. The Americans have outrun their logistics. Patton will halt within days, perhaps hours. No army can sustain such advanced speeds without fuel. It was not a hope. It was a declaration of fact, a law of physics as immutable as gravity. The German war machine, after all, had been built on the principle of blitzkrieg, the lightning war. They knew, better than anyone, the ravenous appetite of a modern armored division. They had written the book on it. 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day, just to keep the tanks moving. Hundreds of tons of ammunition, thousands of replacement parts, food for 16,000 men. The German analysis was meticulous, rooted in their own bitter experience on the endless steppes of Russia. There, the very same logistical limitations had bled their own armies dry. Their advance had faltered not against the Red Army initially, but against the sheer, unforgiving vastness of the land. Now they watched the Americans making the same mistake, falling into the same trap. The German generals, men like Heinrich von Luttwitz and Siegfried Westphal, saw the situation not as a crisis, but as a godsend, an opportunity. Patton's Third Army, the most aggressive, the most feared of the Allied forces, was about to become a static, fuel-starved target. It would grind to a halt, stranded in the fields of France, giving the Wehrmacht precious time to form a new, hardened defensive line along the River Seine. Time to regroup. Time to dig in for the winter. Time, perhaps, to turn the tide. German intelligence reports reinforced this comforting conclusion. They tracked American consumption rates with scientific precision. They knew a Sherman tank burned through a gallon of gasoline every 2 miles on a good road, and far more across country. They knew an infantry division demanded 700 tons of supplies daily, while an armored division needed over 1,000. Patton was commanding 12 such divisions advancing on a 60-mile front. The math was inescapable, irrefutable. 12,000 tons of supplies every single day had to be moved 400 miles over a transportation network the Germans had systematically obliterated during their retreat. It was, by every known standard of military science, a logistical impossibility. On August 20th, General Major Westphal confidently calculated, even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which they don't, and perfect roads, which they don't, they still couldn't sustain Patton's advance more than another 48 hours. Physical laws cannot be violated, not even by American industry. In the bunkers of East Prussia, A quiet, professional laughter could be heard. The reckless Americans, with their Hollywood generals and their amateur army, had finally blundered. Their great breakout was about to become a great embarrassment. But what Alfred Jodl and the entire German High Command did not know, what they could not possibly conceive, was that 25 miles from Patton's thirsty tanks, a miracle was already in motion. On the congested roads leading from the beaches, 5,958 trucks were being marshaled. Their engines were turning over, their fuel tanks were full, and their drivers were receiving orders that defied a century of military doctrine. They were about to form an endless, two-way river of steel, a convoy operating 24 hours a day, with headlights blazing in the night, in brazen defiance of the ever-present threat of air attack. They were about to move 12,500 tons of supplies every single day, a figure that would have shattered the assumptions of Germany's most brilliant logisticians. This was the birth of the Red Ball Express, an operation so audacious, so contrary to the established rules of war, that it existed outside the conceptual framework of the German military mind. It was not a supply line in the traditional sense. It was a weapon. A weapon forged not in a foundry but on the assembly lines of Detroit, and wielded by 23,000 men, 75% of whom were African American soldiers in a segregated army, fighting for freedoms they themselves were denied back home. This is not simply the story of a supply convoy. This is the story of how the fundamental nature of warfare was rewritten in the autumn of 1944. It is the story of how an army of truckers, dismissed and overlooked, became the engine of victory on the Western Front. Our central thesis is this: the long-accepted mythos of World War II, a narrative dominated by brilliant generals, heroic infantrymen, and dramatic battles, is incomplete. The truth, far more profound and transformative, is that the war in Europe was ultimately decided not by tactical brilliance but by logistical dominance. The German war machine wasn't outfought, it was outproduced, outsupplied, and outdriven. The Wehrmacht's laughter in August 1944 was the last gasp of an old way of war. They were about to receive a brutal lesson, delivered at 35 miles per hour, that in the new age of industrial conflict, amateurs may talk tactics, but professionals talk logistics. And in 1944, America was about to show the world it had redefined the very meaning of the word. To understand the sheer revolutionary shock of the Red Ball Express, we must first rewind and understand the world that made it necessary. We must deconstruct the myth of modern warfare, a myth the Germans themselves had perfected. The conventional story of the Second World War, as told in films and popular histories, is one of dramatic action. It is the story of the landing craft hitting Omaha Beach, of paratroopers descending from the night sky, of tank commanders locked in deadly duels across open fields. In this narrative, logistics is a supporting character, a footnote. It is the unglamorous necessary chore of getting beans, bullets, and bandages to the front. The myth is that wars are won by strategy, by the brilliant maneuver of a Rommel or a Patton, and the courage of the soldier in the foxhole. The reality, as history has proven time and again, is that armies, no matter how brave or brilliantly led, march on their stomachs and fight with what they can carry. The German General Staff, the inheritors of a martial tradition stretching back to Frederick the Great, understood this principle intimately. They were masters of the operational art, but they were also slaves to its limitations. Their entire doctrine of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had crushed Poland, France, and the Low Countries, was a high-wire act, a desperate gamble against the tyranny of the supply line. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, on punching through enemy lines with concentrated armored formations and racing deep into their rear, sowing chaos and collapsing their command structure before they could react. But this very speed created an Achilles heel. The faster the panzers advanced, the longer and more fragile their umbilical cord of fuel and ammunition became. This was the hard lesson they learned in the Soviet Union. On the vast, primitive road network of the Russian steppe, The German logistical system, which still relied on horse-drawn wagons for over 80% of its transport, collapsed. Panzers ran out of fuel hundreds of miles from their objectives. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms because winter gear was piled up at railheads 1,000 miles to the west. The Blitzkrieg in the east didn't fail because of Soviet tactical genius in 1941. It drowned in a sea of mud and froze in an icy wasteland because German logistics could not keep pace with German ambition. This experience was seared into the consciousness of every commander in the Wehrmacht. It created a rigid, conservative mindset regarding supply. For them, a 400-mile advance without a secure, functioning railhead immediately behind it was not just risky, it was suicidal. Now let us turn to the summer of 1944. The situation in Normandy was one of bloody stalemate. For nearly 2 months after the D-Day landings, Allied forces had been bottled up in a pocket of land, fighting a brutal war of attrition in the dense, hedgerow country of the Bocage. Progress was measured in yards, and casualties were horrific. Allied planners had a nightmare scenario in mind. A repeat of the trench warfare of World War I, a static front where millions of men would die for inches of ground. The breakout was everything. On July 25, 1944, that breakout came. Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment followed by a concentrated armored thrust, tore a hole in the German lines near St. Lo. Into this gap poured the full might of the American Army, spearheaded by the newly activated Third Army under the command of its aggressive, flamboyant, and controversial leader, General George S. Patton, Jr. What followed was one of the most astonishing advances in military history. The German Seventh Army was encircled and virtually annihilated in the Falaise pocket. The Allied armies fanned out across France, moving at speeds that stunned both their allies and their enemies. Patton's forces, in particular, seemed unstoppable, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, bypassing strongpoints and chewing up German divisions. This incredible success, however, created the very crisis the Germans were now gleefully anticipating. The Allied operational plan had been conservative. It had assumed a slow, methodical advance, with pauses to consolidate, build up supply depots, and, most importantly, repair the French railway system. The French rail network was the designated artery for the Allied supply effort. Trucks were seen as a short-range solution, a means of moving supplies from the railheads to the front lines, a distance of perhaps 50 to 100 miles. No one in the Allied High Command had seriously planned for a scenario where their armies would advance 400 miles in less than a month, leaving the railways a tangled mess of wreckage far behind them. The antagonist in this great drama was not a German field marshal, but a simple, unyielding concept: distance. Every mile Patton advanced was another mile a truck had to travel, consuming more fuel, suffering more wear and tear, and taking longer to make a round trip. The roads themselves were a nightmare. They were narrow, often unpaved, and systematically destroyed by the retreating Germans, who, applying the lessons of Russia, blew every major bridge and mined every key intersection. The Allied supply chain was stretched to the breaking point. The port of Cherbourg, the only deep-water port in Allied hands, was a shambles. The Mulberry harbors, ingenious floating ports built for the invasion, were already operating beyond their intended capacity. Supplies were piling up on the beaches, but the means to move them to the front, where they were desperately needed, was evaporating. This was the world before the turning point, a world of incredible tactical success, creating an existential strategic crisis. On one side, you had Patton, a commander whose entire philosophy was l'audace, l'audace, toujours l'audace, audacity, audacity, always audacity. He was temperamentally incapable of stopping. He demanded fuel, more fuel, believing that one final push could shatter the German army and end the war by Christmas. On the other side, you had the logisticians, the quartermasters, the men with the ledgers and the slide rules, staring at the horrifying math and telling the high command that the advance was unsustainable. And caught in the middle were the men of the U.S. Army's segregated service units. In 1944, the American military was a reflection of American society, deeply divided by race. African American soldiers were, with few exceptions, barred from frontline combat roles. They were relegated to service and supply positions, digging ditches, loading ships, and driving trucks. They were commanded by white officers, slept in separate quarters, and ate in separate mess halls. They were fighting a war against Nazi Germany's ideology of racial supremacy while serving in an institution that practiced its own form of racial segregation. This profound, bitter irony was the backdrop against which the drama of the Red Ball Express would unfold. These were the men who, by an accident of history and a crisis of logistics, were about to be handed the keys to victory. The stakes were immense. If the supply crisis could not be solved, Patton's army would halt. The Germans would stabilize their front. The war would drag on into the winter of 1945, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. The window of opportunity created by the Normandy breakout would slam shut. The myth of blitzkrieg, which the Allies had seemingly mastered, would be proven hollow once more by the unglamorous, unyielding truth of logistics. By the third week of August 1944, the German predictions were no longer theoretical. They were becoming a terrifying reality on the ground. The tanks of Patton's 4th Armored Division, the very tip of the Allied spear, were literally sputtering to a halt in the fields east of Paris, their fuel gauges on empty. Radio messages flooding back to headquarters were no longer requests for fuel. They were desperate pleas. Patton himself, a man of volcanic energy, was apoplectic, raging that the quartermasters were more dangerous to his army than the Germans. The great Allied advance, the magnificent breakout that had promised a swift end to the war, was about to die of starvation. The Allied High Command was faced with a stark, brutal choice. The orthodox military solution was clear: halt the advance, let the infantry catch up, secure the flanks, and wait for the engineers to rebuild the railways. It was the safe option, the sensible option, the one that every military textbook would recommend. It was also the option that would hand the strategic initiative back to the Germans, giving them the breathing room they so desperately needed to form a new defensive line on the West Wall, the formidable Siegfried Line at the German border. To halt was to accept a prolonged, bloody war. It was in this atmosphere of extreme crisis, on the afternoon of August 25, 1944, that the turning point occurred. It didn't happen on a battlefield, but in a requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans, in a room filled with skeptical officers from the Army's communications zone, or ComZ. Before them stood Lieutenant Colonel Lorne Little Patton Ayres, a wiry, energetic officer from the Motor Transport Service. The men in that room had spent days crunching the numbers, and the conclusion was unanimous. The problem was unsolvable by conventional means. There simply weren't enough trucks, enough roads, or enough hours in the day to supply an army moving this fast, this far from its base. Then, Colonel Ayres laid out a plan. It was a plan born not of established doctrine, but of radical desperation and uniquely American ingenuity. It was a vision that treated the roads of France not as a collection of thoroughfares, but as a single, massive conveyor belt. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we're going to create a one-way highway from Cherbourg and the beaches to the front lines." The concept was so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it was met with stunned silence. Ayres continued, his words painting a picture of something that had never been attempted on this scale. 2 major highways would be completely closed to all civilian and non-essential military traffic. One would be for loaded trucks heading east to the front. The other would be for empty trucks returning west to the depots. A continuous circulating loop of supply. The details were even more heretical. The trucks would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The sacrosanct rule of blackout driving, a core tenet of military operations to avoid enemy air attack, would be abandoned. Drivers would use their full headlights at night. Why? Because the Luftwaffe was a broken force, and the risk of halting the supply chain was deemed greater than the risk of an occasional air raid. The trucks would not stop for anything except fuel, mechanical breakdown, or driver changes. Convoys would maintain a steady speed of 35 miles per hour, with a strict 60-yard interval between vehicles. Military police would patrol the route, empowered to remove any truck that dropped below 25 miles per hour, pushing it into a ditch if necessary to keep the artery from clotting. The name for this audacious operation was borrowed from American railroad terminology. A red ball freight was a priority shipment, marked with a large red circle, that took precedence over all other rail traffic. This new highway system would be the Red Ball Express. It would have absolute, unquestioned priority over everything else on the road. To the German military mind, this plan would have been insanity. It was wasteful, undisciplined, and violated every principle of concealment, conservation of resources, and operational security. But it was built on a different philosophy, a philosophy born in the factories of the American Midwest, where German doctrine emphasized efficiency and the careful husbanding of limited resources. The American plan relied on overwhelming volume and redundancy. It accepted waste as a necessary cost of speed. It assumed a high rate of mechanical failure and simply factored in enough replacement vehicles to compensate. It was, as one German general would later lament, mass production applied to warfare. The logistical requirements were staggering. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, another key architect of the plan, calculated they would need a minimum of 140 truck companies, totaling 5,958 vehicles, all operating at a 90% availability rate, a figure unheard of in any army. Yet, the impossible was made operational in just 36 hours. The order was given, and the massive, sprawling logistics apparatus of the U.S. Army in France began to move. On August 26th, the first trucks of the Red Ball Express rolled out. The workhorse of this operation was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, affectionately known by the GIs as the Deuce and a Half. It was a simple, rugged, and astonishingly reliable vehicle, and America had built over 500,000 of them. It was this single piece of machinery, more than the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang, that embodied the industrial might that would ultimately crush the Axis. And into the driver's seats of these trucks climbed the men who would make the system work. Of the 23,000 soldiers who would ultimately serve on the Red Ball Express, nearly 3/4 were African American. They came from quartermaster and transportation corps units, men who had been trained to load cargo and perform manual labor, not to be the lifeblood of a charging army. They were given minimal training, a full tank of gas, a rifle, and a destination hundreds of miles away. They were told to drive until they couldn't drive anymore, and then to keep driving. This was the moment the myth of German logistical superiority was shattered. It was the inciting incident that set in motion a chain of events that would carry the Allied armies to the threshold of Germany itself. The decision to launch the Red Ball Express was a monumental gamble, a rejection of centuries of military prudence. It was a bet that American industrial power, channeled through the tireless efforts of its most marginalized soldiers, could overcome the physical laws of war. As the first convoys rumbled eastward, their headlights cutting through the French night, they weren't just carrying gasoline and ammunition. They were carrying the fate of the war on the Western Front. The Red Ball Express was not a well-oiled machine. It was an act of controlled, sustained chaos. And it was in this chaos that its genius lay. A forensic breakdown of its operations reveals a system that defied every metric of traditional military efficiency, yet achieved a level of effectiveness that left German observers in a state of shock and awe. This was the great twist in the story, the American weakness that the German High Command had identified. Their reliance on machines, their perceived wastefulness, their lack of rigid discipline was, in fact, their greatest strength. The truth was the polar opposite of the myth. Within hours of its launch, the Red Ball Express developed its own unique culture, a set of unwritten rules forged by necessity on the broken roads of France. Drivers, pushed to the limits of human endurance, became legends. They gave their trucks names like Patton's Blood Bank and Detroit to Berlin Express. They learned to drive for 40, 50, even 60 hours straight, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and Benzedrine tablets issued by medics. They hallucinated from exhaustion, seeing phantom obstacles in the road, but they kept going. The official speed limit was 35 miles per hour, but that was merely a suggestion. The real rule was simple: go as fast as you possibly can without crashing. Slower vehicles were expected to pull over instantly. A breakdown was a catastrophe not for the driver, but for the entire system. Mobile maintenance crews, stationed every 50 miles, operated under a brutal triage system. If a truck couldn't be fixed in 15 minutes, it was pushed into the ditch, its cargo transferred to another vehicle, and the convoy rolled on. Cannibalization was rampant. A truck with a blown engine might lose its tires, its alternator, and its transmission to 3 other vehicles within an hour. Nothing was wasted but the vehicle itself. The numbers generated by this chaotic system were simply unbelievable to the German logisticians, who would later study them from captured documents. In its first week of operation, from August 25th to August 31st, the Red Ball delivered 39 tons of supplies. The daily average was 12,048 tons, exceeding the initial optimistic projection. By the time the operation hit its stride, 5,000 vehicles were in constant motion at any given moment. A convoy of 67 trucks departed from the western depots every 5 minutes, around the clock. This relentless, unending river of steel began to have a profound domino effect, not just on the battlefield, but on the psyche of the German army. The first domino to fall was the German defensive plan at the River Seine. The Wehrmacht had expected Patton's halt to give them a week or more to establish a strong line. Instead, just 72 hours after the Red Ball began, Patton's supposedly immobilized tanks, their fuel tanks brimming, crashed through the German positions. The line at the Seine never formed. It was a phantom defense washed away by a torrent of American gasoline. The second domino was the liberation of Paris. Freed from the tether of a static supply chain, Allied forces could maneuver freely. While Patton's Third Army hooked east to cut off retreating Germans, other Allied units were able to swing north and liberate the French capital on August 25th, weeks ahead of the most optimistic schedules. The psychological blow to the German leadership was immense. The third, and most critical domino, was the complete unraveling of the German strategic assessment. Reconnaissance units began sending back panicked and disbelieving reports. An officer from Aufklärungsgruppe 116 radioed from a position overlooking a Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing, no blackout discipline. Americans have abandoned all military precaution. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the convoys, and his report to Army Group B headquarters reflected a dawning horror. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals day and night without pause. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. This phrase, mass production applied to warfare, became the key to understanding the American phenomenon. The Germans, with their emphasis on quality over quantity, could not compete. They had built the magnificent Tiger tank, but for every Tiger produced, America built 50 Shermans. They had master mechanics who could painstakingly rebuild an engine, but the Americans had thousands of competent mechanics who could simply swap one out in 45 minutes. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable commanders, read the reports on the Red Ball Express, and his response revealed a growing sense of existential dread. If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. We cannot defeat this with military tactics, and the ripple effect continued to spread. The very sound of the red ball became a form of psychological warfare. German soldiers dug in for the night could hear the constant, unending roar of thousands of engines in the distance. It was the sound of their own doom, the sound of an enemy with infinite resources, an enemy that never slept. It told them that while they were rationing 3 rounds of ammunition per man, the Americans were bringing up millions. And at the heart of this storm were the African-American drivers. Their presence created a profound cognitive dissonance for the enemy. Nazi ideology was built on a foundation of Aryan racial supremacy, which held black people as subhuman, incapable of mastering complex machinery or showing initiative. Yet here were thousands of black soldiers performing a logistical miracle that the supposedly superior German army could not hope to match. They were disproving the central tenet of Nazism with every mile they drove. They understood this irony keenly. This was their form of combat, their way of fighting back against Hitler and against the discrimination they faced in their own army. Their performance was a direct refutation of racism, delivered with grit, skill, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. By early September, the final dominoes were falling into place. Patton's Third Army, continuously refueled and rearmed by the Red Ball, stood at the German border. The Wehrmacht in France was shattered, not just physically, but morally. The autopsy was complete. The Germans had diagnosed the patient, the Allied army, with a fatal disease called logistical overextension, but they had failed to account for the radical, unprecedented cure. The Red Ball Express hadn't just supplied an army, it had multiplied its speed, shattered the enemy's strategy, and fundamentally altered the operational landscape of the war. The German generals who had laughed in August were silent in September, staring at maps that showed an unstoppable blue tide washing over France, a tide carried forward on a river of trucks. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations on November 16, 1944. After 82 days of relentless, punishing work, the crisis had passed. Allied engineers, in a logistical marvel of their own, had rebuilt enough of the French railway system to take over the main burden of supply. The great conveyor belt was shut down. Its 6,000 trucks were reassigned. Its 23,000 men were given new duties. The roads of France fell quiet. But the legacy of what they accomplished would echo for generations, fundamentally reshaping not only the military but the very fabric of post-war America and the world. Zooming out from the battlefields of 1944, we see the long-term consequences fall like a final set of dominoes, reaching all the way to the present day. The most immediate legacy was military. The Red Ball Express became the foundational text for modern military logistics. It proved, beyond any doubt, the maxim that would be repeated by generations of officers. Amateurs talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. The American military, which had entered the war with a logistics doctrine not much different from that of World War I, emerged as the world's foremost practitioner of large-scale, high-volume supply. The principles of the Red Ball, redundancy over efficiency, speed over perfection, and decentralized execution, became embedded in U.S. military doctrine. The ability to project and sustain power anywhere on the globe, the hallmark of the American military in the Cold War and beyond, has its roots in the lessons learned on those dusty French roads. But perhaps the most profound legacy was social. The Red Ball Express forced an uncomfortable reckoning within the American military itself. The operation's undeniable, spectacular success was overwhelmingly dependent on the performance of African American soldiers. These men, serving in a segregated army, had been deemed unfit for the rigors of combat, yet they had proven themselves to be the indispensable backbone of the Allied advance. They had endured conditions as harsh as any frontline infantryman, exhaustion, enemy fire, and constant danger, and had not faltered. High-ranking officers, including Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, witnessed their performance firsthand. He saw black sergeants masterfully directing traffic at chaotic intersections, white officers relying on the expertise of black mechanics, and integrated teams of drivers helping each other survive. The contradiction between the Army's segregationist policies and the reality of the Red Ball's success was too stark to ignore. It created an undeniable moral and practical pressure for change. While it would take another 3 years, the heroic performance of the Red Ball drivers and other African American units was a powerful catalyst leading to President Harry S. Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the United States Armed Forces. The road to equality was long and arduous, but a critical stretch of it was paved by the deuce and a halves of the Red Ball Express. The operation's influence even spilled over into the civilian world. Thousands of veterans of the Red Ball returned to America with an unparalleled education in transportation management. They had participated in the largest, most complex trucking operation in human history. They understood supply chains, vehicle maintenance, and personnel management on a continental scale. Many of these veterans founded or went to work for trucking companies, applying the lessons of the Express, 24-hour operations, relay systems, and a focus on volume and speed to the world of commerce. They helped build the modern American logistics industry, the intricate web of trucks and highways that powers the nation's economy. The next time you see a convoy of semi-trucks on an interstate highway, you are seeing a direct descendant of the Red Ball Express. The universal lesson of this incredible story transcends military history. It is a lesson about innovation born of necessity and about the hidden strengths that can be found in the most overlooked corners of a society. The German General Staff represented the pinnacle of a traditional, hierarchical, and rigid system. They were experts in a game whose rules were about to change. The Red Ball Express represented something new, a decentralized, adaptable, and seemingly chaotic system that succeeded through the initiative of ordinary individuals. It demonstrated that a democratic society, with all its messiness and internal contradictions, could mobilize its industrial and human resources on a scale that a totalitarian state, for all its supposed efficiency, could not match. This lesson resonates powerfully in our modern world. Today we are more aware than ever of the fragility and importance of global supply chains. We have seen how a single disruption can have cascading effects across the entire planet. The story of the Red Ball Express is a stark reminder that the flow of goods, energy, and information is the true lifeblood of modern civilization, both in peace and in war. It teaches us that resilience often comes not from perfect planning, but from the ability to improvise, adapt, and overwhelm a problem with sheer scale and determination. In the end, we return to that bunker in East Prussia, to the confident, dismissive laughter of the German generals. That laughter was silenced by the roar of 6,000 engines that never stopped. It was silenced by men who drove themselves past the breaking point, not for glory, but because the mission demanded it. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was not efficient. It was wasteful, noisy, and dangerous. But it worked. It kept Patton rolling. It kept the Germans retreating. And it shortened the deadliest conflict in human history, saving countless thousands of lives. The final word belongs to a captured German officer, his name lost to history, who stood by a roadside in Belgium watching the endless convoy thunder past. He turned to his American captors and said, "We prepared for everything. Your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks. How do you defeat an enemy who has more trucks than you have soldiers?" The answer rolled past him every 5 minutes, in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. It was an answer driven by forgotten soldiers who were, for 82 frantic days, the most important men in the world. They were rewriting the rules of war, proving that logistics was no longer the servant of strategy, but its master. They were driving a one-way road to victory.